The giant, real-feel Reptimax Hatzegopteryx is here. It's not a bird, it's not a dinosaur. This giant giraffe-sized pterosaur is one of the largest creatures to ever fly, and it's now ready to glide into your collection. Fully posable with real feel skin and wings. Watch out for its terrifying beak. This giant predator is just as deadly on the ground as it is in the air. When this pterosaur is hungry, there's nowhere to hide. Order your own real feel Hatzegopteryx figure now at our website www.reptimax.co.za. Get yours now before they go extinct. This is a limited edition figure and we will only have a few of these available.
Hello everyone, I'm so excited to finally show you my real feel Hatzegopteryx action figure. I've been waiting so long to finally get this giant pterosaur out into the world. I created the original version of this figure in September last year, but it still needed a lot of adjustments before it could be released. However, before we go into all the details and have a closer look at this figure, I want to talk about Hatzegopteryx as a species and give you more information on this truly incredible animal. I am beyond excited to announce that for this video I had the wonderful opportunity to speak with Dr. Darren Naish to learn more about this remarkable pterosaur. Darren is a famous British paleontologist, author and science communicator. He has contributed greatly towards our understanding of prehistoric life, creating many incredible books and working as a chief scientific advisor and consultant for many TV shows, such as Apple TV's Prehistoric Planet series. The latest season of Prehistoric Planet is now available to stream on Apple TV and focuses on the Ice Age. If you haven't already seen this series, please watch it. This show features the most up-to-date, scientifically accurate depictions of ancient life, and the visuals are absolutely mind-blowing. Dr. Naish was kind enough to send me some footage to give us some more information on Hatzegopteryx, including what we currently know about this animal's appearance, where the species lived, and what made Hatzegopteryx so different when compared to other pterosaurs.
Right, so what is Hatzegopteryx, or Hatzegopteryx thambema to use its full two-part name? Hatzegopteryx is a pterosaur. It's a member of the group of flying reptiles that are related to dinosaurs. They're cousins of the dinosaurs. And more specifically, Hatzegopteryx is part of the group of pterosaurs called the Azhdarchids. Now, Azhdarchids are long-snouted, long-jawed pterosaurs that we first got to know during the 1970s. They ranged in size from animals with a wingspan of about 3 meters, so about as big as the biggest living flying bird, but then there were giant species which had wingspans of something like 10 to 11 meters, and Hatzegopteryx is one of these gigantic Azhdarchid pterosaurs. Hatzegopteryx is a relatively new animal on the scene. It was named in 2002 by 3 scientists, Eric Buffetot, Dan Grigorescu and Zoltan Chikisava, and they named it from fossils found in the Hatzeg Basin of Romania. So Hatzegopteryx is a Romanian, as an Eastern European giant Azhdarchid pterosaur named during the 2000s. What would Hatzegopteryx have looked like when it was alive? Well, this is quite a difficult question to answer because the fossils we have are not tremendously complete. In fact, Hatzegopteryx was first described for just 2 parts of the skeleton: a partial humerus, that's the bone at the top of the arm, and the back of the skull. Now, this skull section of Hatzegopteryx is really interesting. It's so broad and robust that when first first reported in 1991, it was misidentified as that of a theropod dinosaur. If we want to know what Hatzegopteryx looked like when it was complete, we have to compare it to other giant Ashdarchids known from better remains, and the standard comparison that we make is with the giant North American Ashdarchid Quetzalcoatlus. Quetzalcoatlus basically has a really long skull. Its skull would have superficially resembled that of a giant stork. It had a quite long slender neck that was similar in size to this really long skull. We are talking about a skull that's over 2 meters long and a neck that's similar in length. These giant Ashdarchids had an enormous wingspan, as I've said, about 10 to 11 meters. Their upper arm and radius and ulna, the forearm section, these were both quite robust and muscular. Although the wingspan was huge, the interesting thing is that the wing finger, the end part of the wing, was actually proportionally short relative to that of other pterosaurs. And we know from articulated pterosaur skeletons and from pterosaur trackways that these animals could actually fold up the wing membrane and therefore walk with a totally folded wing. And the trackways show, we know this from Ashdarchid trackways, we know that the hands and the feet were kept close in line, close to the middle of the body, giving these animals quite like a narrow gait. Other interesting thing worth saying about giant Ashdarchids is that their hind limbs, their back legs, were long and slender, and this is all in keeping with the idea that they were probably very terrestrially competent. They were really good at walking around on the ground on all fours using a particular behavioral technique called terrestrial stalking. This is an idea that Mark Whitton and I published in 2008. We think that giant Ashdarchids were highly competent animals on the ground. They were great at flying around, they were great at soaring, but they also were able to fold up those giant wings and walk quadrupedally. Now, what makes Hatzegopteryx quite unusual is that neck bones that almost certainly come from this pterosaur indicate that its neck wasn't as long and slender as that of other giant Ashdarchids like Quetzalcoatlus. So whereas Quetzalcoatlus might have had a neck about 2 meters long, that of Hatzegopteryx was maybe 50 to 60% shorter. So it's quite difficult to imagine this animal when it was alive, because it's not really quite like anything alive today. You've got to imagine a giant flyer with enormous membranous wings that was able to fold up those wings and walk around quadrupedally on the ground. It would have had a head that resembled that of a giant stork with phenomenally long jaws, but it would have had a relatively robust and thick neck that was still quite a long neck for the size of the animal. We also know from Ashdarchid fossils that these animals had a head crest of some kind, some big kind of like raised structure somewhere above the eyes. And we also know from good fossils of numerous smaller pterosaurs that pterosaurs were furry animals, and we've got every reason to think that that was true of Ashdarchids. When we come to these giant species, however, we do not know exactly how furry they were. Were they entirely fur covered all over the body? Well, maybe they were, but maybe they had large naked patches to help them lose heat. They may also have been able to lose heat and in fact control their body temperature overall via the collection of heat or the dumping of heat through the massive wing membranes, because of course the wing membranes were made of skin, and in this respect pterosaurs are kind of more like bats than they are like birds. So we're talking about a giant flying furry membranous winged long-billed animal, long-snouted, long-skulled animal that's able to fold up its wings and walk around quadrupedally, kind of like a mix of giraffe-like proportions but with a stork-like head with a notably thick muscular neck. Not really like anything alive today. A truly remarkable animal. What makes Hatzegopteryx unusual relative to other Ashdarchids? When Hatzegopteryx was first named, it was based on the back part of a skull and a partial humerus, the upper arm bone. And the anatomy of that humerus is really remarkable because its internal texture has this kind of like system of like large air cells that looks like expanded polystyrene. If you imagine breaking polystyrene apart and seeing these kind of like large connected air cells, that's what the internal texture, the bone texture of the Hatzegopteryx humerus is like, and this isn't seen in other Ashdarchids. Now, since 2002, various other Ashdarchid fossils from elsewhere in the Romanian Upper Cretaceous have been identified as probable additional Hatzegopteryx bones. They include the end part of what seems to be a really big lower jaw, a few vertebrae, some bones from the shoulder girdle, and a partial femur, a thigh bone. And those bones also have this unusual expanded polystyrene type internal texture. So that seems to be a diagnostic trait of Hatzegopteryx. Presumably it's a strengthening adaptation and maybe also a lightening one, a feature that made its skeleton relatively light for its size. Now Hatzegopteryx, as I've said, also has this unusually thick, robust neck, but we have since discovered that other kinds of Azhdarchid also have relatively thick, robust necks, and in fact some of these animals might be especially closely related to Hatzegopteryx, maybe forming like a special little subgroup of Azhdarchid pterosaurs. When Hatzegopteryx was alive during the Maastrichtian part of the late Cretaceous, most of Romania existed as an island, and we know this island as Hatzeg Island. It was separated by about 200 kilometers of sea from the nearest continental landmass, which was to its northeast. There were various other islands to the southwest, and there were other continental landmasses to the northwest of Hatzeg Island. If it was an island, and experts do actually argue about this, but if it was an island, it was a pretty big one with a surface area of around about 80,000 square kilometers, which makes it about equivalent to modern big Caribbean islands like Hispaniola. So if Hatzegopteryx was an island dwelling animal, this is a really interesting aspect of its evolution and biology, because we know from modern islands and from islands, from the geological past as well, that animals do really unusual things on islands. Small animals often become big, big animals often become small, many animals just become weird. And many animals take on unusual ecological roles relative to their continental ancestors. Now, we already think, as I've explained, that Azhdarchid pterosaurs were terrestrial stalkers. They were probably highly competent terrestrial predators that folded up their wings, walked around on the ground, and were reaching down to pick up such things as large lizards, small mammals, baby dinosaurs, prey items like that. So presumably Hatzegopteryx had that kind of lifestyle. However, there's two things to consider here. Number one is, as I've already said, Hatzegopteryx appears to have had a particularly robust, thick, muscular neck relative to other Azhdarchids. The back part of its skull is also notably robust, and both of these facts kind of suggest that maybe Hatzegopteryx was capable of tackling larger prey items than were other Azhdarchids. The second thing is that large theropod dinosaurs, large predatory dinosaurs, so far as we can tell, are entirely absent from the ecosystem of Hatzeg Island. There were some small theropods, animals that at most were say 20-30 kilos in size, but there's no large terrestrial predators in terms of dinosaurs known from the island. So we do actually wonder whether Hatzegopteryx might have filled that role. Might it actually have been a large, formidable predator capable of subduing, tackling, killing and consuming larger prey items than was typical for Azhdarchids elsewhere? Could it have consumed prey items similar in size to, say, like, a small person? Well, this is a really interesting question. It's actually the subject of ongoing research right now. We certainly do think that Hatzegopteryx was a terrestrial predator of terrestrial prey, small dinosaurs, small mammals, lizards, other such animals. Was it actually killing and consuming prey larger and more difficult to subdue than the kind of prey typical for Azhdarchids elsewhere? Well, that's a good question, but it's very likely that it did have a top predator role in the Hatzeg Island ecosystem. Was Hatzegopteryx flight capable? Now, this is a really interesting question. As a member of an otherwise flight capable group that appears to have been restricted in distribution to an island, albeit a really large one, many experts have asked the question, does this mean that Hatzegopteryx might have been flightless? Now, we know primarily from birds, but from some other flying animals as well, like insects, we know that flightlessness has repeatedly evolved among island-dwelling organisms. We also know, as I've explained, that Hatzegopteryx was a large and robustly built predator, perhaps of relatively large animals. So it's an island-dwelling member of an otherwise flight-capable group, and it's a predator and perhaps a top predator. Does this mean that it was perhaps flightless? Well, the problem is that when people consider flightlessness in flight-capable animals, they're generally thinking of birds. And we know that birds on islands have evolved flightlessness hundreds of times. It's probably the case that birds can easily evolve flightlessness because the wing is an entirely separate organ from the leg. Now, if you compare that with bats, in bats, the wing membrane means that the arm, the forelimb, is always connected to the hind limb, the leg. And this might explain why bats, so far as we know, have never evolved flightlessness. The forelimb and hind limb are both part of the same flight module. That's the idea. Now, so far as we can tell, that's also the case in pterosaurs. In pterosaurs, the forelimb and hind limb, the arm and the leg, are also both connected by the wing membrane, perhaps meaning that pterosaurs just couldn't evolve flightlessness. Now, if we think specifically about what we know of Hatzegopteryx compared to other Azhdarchids, there's actually nothing about Hatzegopteryx that really makes it look that different from other Azhdarchids, even the really giant ones like Quetzalcoatlus, that we think were truly flight capable. It seems from what we know of the skeleton that Hatzegopteryx had bones that were relatively lightweight for the animal's size. The humerus, the upper arm bone, has the giant muscle attachments and the same bone thickness that you would expect for an Azhdarchid that was flight capable. It was able to engage in powerful flapping flight. There's enough muscular strength and bone thickness in the upper arm to allow a launch from the ground, and the other bones that we have from Hatzegopteryx don't look that different from other flight capable Azhdarchids. So there's no reason to think that Hatzegopteryx was flightless based on what we know so far. But it's a really interesting idea. We hope that more remains will be discovered that will shed light on this issue, and it's certainly something that experts on this group of pterosaurs have considered.
Thank you so much, Dr. Naish, for taking the time to give us all this information and for collaborating with me in this video. Hatzegopteryx was a truly remarkable pterosaur, and it has been such a delight to learn more about this wonderful animal. Now let's take a look at how this figure was made. Then we'll take a closer, more in-depth look at the final figure and its official packaging. We'll then explain how you can order one of these figures for yourself. I've always wanted to create my own pterosaur figure, but for a long time I just didn't know how to design it. When we look back at all the pterosaur figures that have been made, such as many of the pteranodon figures from Jurassic Park and the more recent Jurassic World toy lines, they all mostly follow a similar trend, often resulting in very flat figures which tend to take up a large surface area when displayed and are unable to stand on their own feet. Pterosaur wings can be quite tricky when translated into plastic, as they can't naturally fold up, bend or shift like they would in life. Some pterosaur and other flying creatures have more articulation in their shoulders, such as the Rheacattac pteranodon from the Jurassic Park 3 toy line, and many Dimorphodon from Mattel's Jurassic World line, or the remarkable fell beast figure from the nostalgic Lord of the Rings toys. These toys are a lot better when it comes to a standing or a more neutral grounded position, and can look very good, especially in the case of the fell beast. However, it still doesn't look quite right for the pterosaurs. I knew that if I was going to create my very own pterosaur figure, it would have to be able to fold up its wings into a comfortable standing position and stretch its wings out into a flying pose. I was just looking into the idea of making the wings out of fabric when I first saw exactly what I wanted to do. I remember one day I just happened to be scrolling on Instagram when I happened to come across Hikigane creatures and all her incredible work. What stood out to me the most in particular were her amazing Quetzalcoatlus art dolls. These look absolutely stunning, and they were exactly what I wanted to do for my very own pterosaur figure. I was absolutely over the moon. I had originally planned to also make a Quetzalcoatlus, but after seeing Hikigane's beautiful creations, I thought it would be better to instead focus on a lesser known species and bring more light to them. So I decided on Hatzegopteryx, as it's just such a wonderfully weird giant pterosaur, which is also perhaps the oddest member of the Ashdarchid family. Now that I had decided on which species to go for, it was time to design my interpretation of this animal. As Dr. Darren Naish said, Hatzegopteryx is currently only known to us from a very small amount of fossilized material, so many aspects of the animal's true appearance are completely unknown. I knew from the start that I didn't want to straight up copy an already existing design such as the prehistoric planet depiction. Why not rather take this opportunity to offer a completely different look and depiction of this creature that no one has ever seen before? I believe when it comes to the true appearance of prehistoric life, it's important to always keep an open mind to something completely different, especially when the animal in question is known from such a small amount of fossilized material. So I thought long and hard about my Hatzegopteryx design and what I imagined this extraordinary creature would have looked like in life. I thought to myself that since Hatzegopteryx is believed to have been fairly active on the ground, presumably hunting, running, and potentially moving around a lot on land, I thought this giant giraffe-sized pterosaur may have had to have some way to quickly and effectively cool itself down, especially after an activity like chasing down a fast-moving small dinosaur. They may have needed a bare area to help them thermoregulate. There are truly no animals alive today that are like giant Ashdarchids. The closest living creatures that are similar in appearance to them are large birds like storks. Out of all the extant stork species, the robust and massive marabou stork is probably the closest we have to a Hatzegopteryx, and they have a very distinctive bald head and neck. In fact, all the largest birds we have today have a mostly naked head and neck, such as ostriches, emus, and cassowaries, all of which are known to use their bare areas as thermal windows to help them cool down in their warm environments. When Hatzegopteryx was alive during the Maastrichtian age of the late Cretaceous, the world was generally a warmer place than it is today. Perhaps even more reason to think that Hatzegopteryx would have had a bare head and neck too. So I decided to give this trait to my Hatzegopteryx. However, the rest of the main body is covered in pycnofibers to keep the animal's comparatively small body insulated, especially when flying. This could also be an effective way to also appreciate the real feeling of my creations, so the customer will get to experience the best of both worlds for a real feel figure, with rubber, fabric, and fur all combined into one figure, which will all have a unique texture. When it comes to the head crest, I decided to go for something similar to what is known for the head crest of the closely related Quetzalcoatlus. Since this species is known from more complete remains and is a close relative, it seems likely that Hatzegopteryx could have had something similar going on up there. This sort of thing is done quite often in paleontology, where a more complete relative's remains are used to fill in the gaps for an animal which is only known from a small amount of fossilized material. By complete accident, I realized only after I had finished designing and creating the figure that my Hatzegopteryx quite closely matches the depiction for the fell beasts in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings novels. They are the dragon-like creatures the ringwraiths ride in Peter Jackson's movies. However, in the books they are described as large winged prehistoric creatures with beaks and an overall appearance similar to large carrion birds, which sounds very familiar. They are even described as being devoid of feathers like the head and neck of my figure. This was quite a happy surprise as I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. Once I had decided on the design of this figure, I printed out my drawn reference to the correct size and the time came to finally start sculpting my Hatzegopteryx. I knew that a completely different approach was needed compared to the other creatures I've made so far, since my Hatzegopteryx was only going to have its head, neck, and feet sculpted in detail, while the main body, limbs, and wings were going to be covered in fabric. I started out with the head by getting the general shape out of tinfoil. Then once I'm happy with how it looks, I then apply a little bit of milliput putty to the inside of the mouth. It's very easy to sculpt with, however once you mix these two parts together, you have about 2 to 3 hours to get all your sculpting done before it starts to harden and can no longer be manipulated. I usually can only work on one part of the animal per day, giving my full attention to that single area and giving it as much sculpted detail as possible before the putty hardens. How much I can do in one day is entirely dependent on the animal I'm sculpting. Scaly creatures like dinosaurs can take quite a long time to sculpt with all the attention and focus the scales need, but luckily our Hatzegopteryx isn't too tricky. There has been no evidence to suggest that pterosaurs had scaly skin, so for the bald head and neck, I gave my Hatzegopteryx more of a wrinkly texture, similar to modern marabou storks and vultures. Once the head, jaw, and neck were done, I then got to work on those little feet. Feet and hands can be very fiddly to create. I usually first start with rolling up some little pieces of milliput and forming them into some sharp little claws. The next day I select the best looking little claws and put them aside for when I start the feet. I've found it's best to start sculpting flat feet on a piece of thick tinfoil, then place the claws on the ends of those delicate little toes. Once they have hardened, I then peel off the feet from the foil and sculpt the underside, repeating this process 3 more times for each foot or hand. The main body and limbs are very simple, since we really just need the shape of these areas and any sculpted detail will be lost beneath the fabric. All I had to mainly focus on was making sure each part aligned with the printed out reference. For the main body's articulation, I used a very strong and thick bendy wire which threads through all of the limbs. It works really well and the cast limbs help to keep the wire bending at the correct spots for more naturalistic poses. When I put my first Hatzegopteryx together, it was having a hard time standing up. It kept on falling forward due to the heavier head and neck. The neck also started tilting to the side. I went back to the drawing board and thankfully found a way to fix it. I went for an even stronger bendy wire which helped tremendously and reinforced the connection from the neck to the torso. Originally I only had bendy wire holding the neck and head up, which really wasn't a good idea. Instead, I found these fantastic doll armature ball joints online. They are incredibly strong, lightweight, and worked perfectly. I was absolutely over the moon. When your creations can stand unaided on their own feet, it's one of the greatest feelings in the world. Just look at the difference in posture between the first attempt with the wire neck and the second with the new ball jointed neck. Then came the time time to find the best fabric for our pterosaur's wings. I was lucky enough to find this fantastic fabric at a local dress store which looked perfect. It has a leathery feel and looks a lot like wing membrane. It also was available in 2 colors, a light brown and a grey, which matched the grey coloration of the Hatzegopteryx head, neck and feet. It was simply meant to be. However, something I didn't know at the time was how incredibly hard it would be to find more of this fabric in the future. At the time, I only bought a small amount of fabric to test it out and see if it would work well. Once I was happy with the finished figure, I set out to find more of this material, and I literally could not find it anywhere. It seemed to have completely vanished from every single fabric store in South Africa. This turned my Hatzegopteryx figure into a special limited edition run by complete accident. However, I'll go into more detail about this later. For the Hatzegopteryx's fur-like pycnofibers, I looked for some fluffy teddy bear fabric. Luckily again, I was able to find material which matched the colors of the Hatzegopteryx. I wasn't exactly sure how I would tackle this area of anatomy. For the first attempt, I completely covered the wings in furry fabric, which really didn't look good. I don't know what I was thinking. It's so weird and you can't see the form of the body beneath at all. I then cut little cubes out of this fabric and glued it onto the wings. I was trying to give it a weathered, shaggy, vulture-y look. I thought it was better than before and I took many pictures and videos of this version, but it still was nowhere near good enough. I tried again. This time I measured each segment of the body and wings, cutting out pieces in the furry fabric that would fit perfectly over the body parts beneath the leathery material. I also shaved down the fur on these pieces, which was a huge improvement. The third attempt was a success. I'm so happy with how this figure looks. The shortened fur is so much better, and by restricting it to just cover the limbs and torso, it gives so much more form to the body parts under the fabric. Before we have a more in-depth look at the final version of this figure, let's have a look at the official packaging I created for my Hatzegopteryx. Just like the Mapusaurus before, the box has a sunset vibe, which is something I would like to continue for all my Mesozoic animals. You may remember from my other videos that I want each era of our world's history to be distinct on the packaging of my figures. So if you were to see my figures displayed in a store, you would instantly recognize which era these animals belong to, even when viewed from a distance. I want to keep the sunset orangey yellow theme for Mesozoic, blue for the Cenozoic, and purple for the Paleozoic. On the front of the box, we have my artwork of a Hatzegopteryx standing on a coastal rock with a subtle silhouette of Hatzeg Island in the background. On the bottom left of the box, we have my Reptimax logo, along with the name Hatzegopteryx in bold lettering. Towards the top, we have my label indicating that this figure is scientifically accurate and has real feel skin. Inside the box, we have my coastal sunset artwork in its entirety surrounding the place where the figure sits. There are ferns on the floor of the box, and we have a little card plinth which further helps to secure the Hatzegopteryx and raise it up. On the right side of the box, we have a big picture of the Hatzegopteryx figure, which was taken at Hout Bay in Cape Town. Below we have my logo again with a Made in South Africa label and another to indicate that this figure is completely handmade. No AI, digital sculpting or 3D printing was involved in the making of this figure. On the left we have another illustration of my Hatzegopteryx showing just how massive this animal was in comparison to a 1.8 meter tall human. Below we have some information on the species, along with the previously mentioned logos and labels, which are mirrored from the previous side. On the back of the box we have two pictures of the figure, one where the Hatzegopteryx is in a standing position and the other is in a flying pose with its wings outstretched. These pictures were taken along the south coast of my home province of KwaZulu-Natal. Above the pictures we have text describing how you can pose the figure. Below we have my logo and labels again, and a group illustration of all the other Mesozoic animals I'm hoping to make soon. Here you can see some hints of what could be the next figure I make. Towards the bottom right we have text explaining more about me and what I do. On the top of the box we have the bold lettering of the name of the species again, with my drawing of what I thought a female Hatzegopteryx may have looked like. When we looked at the group illustration of the other planned Mesozoic animals on the back of the box, you probably already noticed her. Originally, when I was thinking about all the animals I wanted to make for my first ever Mesozoic lineup, I thought it could be really cool to make a male and female Hatzegopteryx, with the idea behind it being that the male with its tall head crest would be larger while the female would be smaller in scale and more affordable for people on a budget, basically doing something similar to what Kenner did for their classic old Jurassic Park toy line by making two Tyrannosaurus figures, the bigger and more expensive adult red T-Rex and the smaller and more affordable young T-Rex. Sexual dimorphism has been found in several different pterosaur species, often with the males having large crests on their head and females either having very small crests or nothing at all. I thought this could be a fantastic and educational way to basically offer two different price ranges on the same species while also learning about how different pterosaur genders could look, with the added bonus of potentially having a Hatzegopteryx family in your collection. However, I'm not too sure if I should still do this. I've got so many other species on my list that I want to make. When I tackle another pterosaur, maybe it would rather be better to go for a completely different species, like a Quetzalcoatlus or Pteranodon. Please let me know what you think or would prefer in the comments. Now let's take a good look at the final Hatzegopteryx itself. Firstly, let's look at the head. The Hatzegopteryx has blue eyes and a red crest to impress. The vibrancy of this red coloration is a bit different on each of these figures, with some having more of a striking scarlet red, while others have more of a blood red color. Just like how in nature every individual is unique. We have a giant beak which can open wide and snatch up any small dinosaurs with a glossy inside to the mouth. The neck is very thick, just like what Dr. Naish described. I've also added more different shades of grey on the head and neck, which I think looks much better than my first few attempts. We then transition into the fluffy body with those giant fabric wings. They feel very realistic, and I'm so glad I was able to find material which is so similar in color to the other parts of the body. The grey fabric on the top side of the pterosaur matches the grey of the head, neck and feet so well. As mentioned earlier, you can easily fold up the wings to have your Hatzegopteryx in a flying or standing position. Taking a closer look at the little feet, or technically fingers, on each wing, just like the head and neck, they are made out of rubber and you can rotate them. Their joints are made out of a smaller version of the doll armature joints I found online. My molder and caster Erica made molds of these joints and cast them in a different plastic which adheres much better to the glue we are using and overall is easier to work with. The hind feet, however, are fully glued into place, which I found was very much needed for giving this large figure more more stability. I am really so happy with how this figure turned out. It's exactly what I wanted to achieve when making a pterosaur figure. The only thing that's a bit tricky about this Hatzegopteryx is the process involved in making one. The stitching required for the wings is very time consuming and demands a lot of attention. With all the projects going on in my life, I can only dedicate an hour or two towards stitching each day, which results in me taking a whole week to finish just the fabric and furry parts of this figure. This is one reason why the figure is so expensive and partly why it's a limited edition release. However, the main reason I can only make 8 of these is due to the awesome leather-like fabric that I like so much. I really didn't expect both the grey and lighter brown versions of this material to completely disappear from all the shops. I looked all over Durban and I literally could not find any more of this fabric anywhere. The only material I had to work with was the original small amount I bought just to test everything out. This isn't to say that these 8 are the only Hatzegopteryx figures I'll ever make, but these are the only ones that'll have this particular material for the wings. I currently haven't found any other fabric that is on par and just as good as the original leathery material I found, but when I do, I'll be sure to update you with the new look for more future Hatzegopteryx figures. Now for a size comparison, here is my Hatzegopteryx next to a 1/18th scale humanoid figure, which is about right to how big this animal really was next to a human. Here it is next to the Walking with Dinosaurs iguanodon figure, which is similar in size to the prey Hatzegopteryx may have gone after in life. The Deinonychus from Creative Beast Studios, my previous figures, the Rubidia and Anos transceiver, my newly improved Mapusaurus figure, which can stand perfectly by itself, and finally here is the Hatzegopteryx along with all the other finished figures I've made so far, including the prototype for my real feel woolly mammoth figure, and the Walking with Beasts Andrewsarchus figure. These 2 are my next figures which will release and become available very soon. Please keep an eye on my social media for more updates coming soon. There are currently still 5 of these figures which I can make with what I have available, so if you want one, please place your order on my website now before it's too late. I would like to give another huge thanks to Dr. Darren Naish for collaborating with me in this video. I never imagined I would ever be able to work with someone I've looked up to for so long. Please also check him out on TikTok and Instagram. Dr. Naish will also join us for the Andrewsarchus video along with another very special guest. So please keep your eye on my channel for more videos coming soon. I would also like to give a big thank you to my patron Sam Allred for your ongoing support. If you would like to help support me further, please check out my Patreon. You'll be able to see more of my art and sneak peeks at upcoming figures. I also want to give a big thanks to Carly Lowe for presenting this figure and shooting this video's intro with me. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.